You might not remember the name Thomas Cromwell clearly, but you are living in the world. He built a world where loyalty is something to be bought and sold, where the law is rewritten in blood, and where a single nod from the king can end an entire family line. He was the one who sent Anne Boleyn to the scaffold, and yet it was the very same king he had served so loyally who later ordered his beheading. Cromwell did not come from noble blood. He was not born in a castle, nor did any soldier escort him to school. He came from Putney, the son of a violent blacksmith and drunk, a man repeatedly fined for beating neighbours and customers alike. And it was that very boy, at about 14 years old, who fled England with nothing but bare hands and a heart full of hatred. But destiny is not something everyone knows how to seize. Cromwell did. He joined the French army, wandered into Italy, and witnessed the collapse of Cesare Borgia, the man once considered invincible after the death of his father. Pope Alexander VI, and the strategic betrayal of his enemies. There, Cromwell learned his first lesson in power. Empires don't fall from strength, but from the schemes within. From that moment on, he knew that true power didn't require a sword, only the ability to plant seeds of doubt. When he returned to England around the year 1512, Cromwell was no longer the battered child. He spoke 3 languages, understood banking, and most importantly, could read fear in men's eyes. He married a wealthy widow, expanded his network, became a lawyer, and then the right hand of Cardinal Wolsey, the man who effectively ruled England, while King Henry VIII was still hunting and feasting. Wolsey taught Cromwell the second lesson: to survive near a tyrant. Never let him hear the word no. For Cromwell, no barrier was too high, no law too fixed as long as it pleased the king. Then came Henry VIII's greatest crisis. He needed a new wife to produce a male heir. Catherine of Aragon had only given him Mary. The Pope refused to grant a divorce. Wolsey failed and fell from grace. But Cromwell did not. He thought differently. He didn't try to change the Pope's mind. He changed the Church itself. In the year 1534, with the Act of Supremacy, Henry became head of the Church of England. And Cromwell, he became the brain, the hand, and the blade of the king. He redrew England's power structure in black ink and red blood. Hundreds of monasteries dissolved. Wealth flooded the treasury. Thousands died under laws. Cromwell helped create. He didn't need executioners, he needed laws. And silence. And then, there was Anne Boleyn, the woman who made Henry obsessed, who married him in secret, wore a crown before the church could catch up. Anne was unlike any other woman at court. She didn't fear Cromwell, nor did she flatter Henry. She challenged, argued, and cared about the poor. That alone made Cromwell despise her. To him, power wasn't for those who spoke of compassion. When Anne failed to produce a son, when Henry's gaze grew cold, Cromwell struck with surgical precision. He built a narrative like crafting a perfect tragedy. Mark Smeaton tortured into confessing adultery. Henry Norris arrested without evidence. Even George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was accused of incest. Cromwell turned laughter into lust, gifts into bribes, and private conversations into treason. 5 men died because they stood too close to a woman who was no longer loved. On the 15th of May in the year 1536, Anne was convicted of treason, incest, and adultery. 4 days later, she was beheaded by a French swordsman. Cromwell had arranged to keep the royal image dignified. And in that moment when her head fell, Cromwell believed he had won, that no one could replace him beside the king. But Henry VIII never kept anyone close for too long. When Cromwell pushed religious reforms further than the king wanted, when he signed foreign treaties without permission, and especially when he arranged the marriage to Anne of Cleves, a woman Henry did not love, he made a fatal misstep. The king did not want to be controlled, and in his growing arrogance, Cromwell forgot the golden rule. The king doesn't need evidence to kill, he only needs a reason. On the 10th of June in the year 1540, Cromwell entered a routine Privy Council meeting and never walked out. He was imprisoned, charged with treason, heresy, and corruption, the very charges he had invented to destroy others. Inside the Tower of London, he wrote desperate letters pleading for mercy not for those he had sent to the scaffold, but for himself, for displeasing the king. On the 28th of July that same year, Cromwell was beheaded. The crowd did not weep. They stood silent, not from grief, but from fear. They understood if someone like Cromwell could fall so easily, then no one was safe. Yet his legacy did not die with him. Cromwell had created a world where no man was safe, where evidence was an illusion, and where a royal frown could end a dynasty. He had taught England the meaning of absolute power, and England used that very lesson to destroy him swiftly, cleanly, and without regret, long before he stood beside kings, long before he orchestrated the death of a queen, before even the ink of Parliament was stained with his hand. Thomas Cromwell was just a boy running for his life. There was no prophecy, no noble tutor whispering secrets of court in his ear, only a pounding heart and the lingering stench of blood on his father's fists. The streets of Putney were small, filthy, and hard, but harder still was the man he called father. Walter Cromwell, a blacksmith by trade, and a drunk by compulsion who did not see his son as a child, but as a target for frustration and a prisoner to his failures. Neighbours looked away when they heard the screaming. They'd heard it before. What could they do? This was just how it was. But Thomas, even as a boy, knew he was not born to be broken. He waited. He watched, and one morning, before the sun had fully risen and before his father could reach for the bottle, Thomas slipped away, barefoot and starving, into a world that should have swallowed him whole. The year was somewhere around 1503, and England was still bleeding from the Wars of the Roses. The nobility were rebuilding. The merchants were rising, and power was beginning to taste like something new gold. Not just blood, but for a peasant child with no family, not coin, and no protection. Survival meant becoming something different, and Thomas became that something. In France, he sold his sword to the army. In Italy, he sold his eyes and ears to the streets. By the time he was barely past 20, he had witnessed the rise and fall of Cesare Borgia, the shadow prince of the Vatican, a man so ruthless he made the devil look merciful. Thomas watched as Cesare, who had ruled with absolute command over cities, mercenaries, and bishops, lost it all in mere months. Not to war, not to rebellion, but to silence, to whispers, to the absence of protection, when his father, Pope Alexander VI, died. Cromwell never forgot it. It was not swords that killed Borgia. It was absence. It was the absence of power, and absence could be arranged. In the alleys of Florence, in the courts of Venice, in the smoky chambers of Milan, Thomas learned not just how to speak Italian, French, Latin, but how to listen. He learned what men said when they thought no one heard. He learned what bribes could do, what fear could buy, what a single wrong word could cost. He watched merchants manipulate dukes, and bankers dictate the terms of war. He learned that gold never needed to shout. That knowledge how to observe, how to calculate, how to disappear into the room, and yet control every eye became his armor. He never wore steel again. He never needed to. By the time he returned to England around the year 1512, the world saw only a modest cloth merchant, a man with connections in Antwerp, a quiet husband with a respectable wife, Elizabeth Wykes, a widow with children and status. But beneath the surface, Thomas was already building. Every client was a future debt to be called, every favor, a coin to be spent later. He read law. He helped the merchant class fight land disputes. He He settled trade grievances with a calm mind and a precise hand. People began to speak his name in circles where his father would never have been allowed to stand. And then, the moment arrived, the one that would lift him from clever commoner to architect of power, Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man in England, after the king himself. Notice the blacksmith's son. Wolsey was not like the others. He did not come from old money. He had climbed, and so when he saw Cromwell, he saw not a threat, but a reflection. He gave him tasks small. At first manage a property dispute here, oversee a difficult land seizure there. But Cromwell never asked questions, never hesitated, never failed. When Wolsey needed monasteries dissolved to fund his pet college project, Thomas did it without flinching. He filed the legal papers. He silenced the abbots. He removed the tenants. He made people disappear quietly, efficiently, legally. That was the key. Not just cruelty, but cruelty with paperwork. Violence wrapped in parchment. And in those years with Wolsey, Thomas learned the third lesson. Kings do not want justice. They want results. Henry VIII was not yet the bloated tyrant history would remember. He was still young, still charming, still desperate for an heir, and full of contradictions. He played the prince of chivalry and the butcher of tradition in the same breath. Other men were afraid of him. Cromwell was not. Because Cromwell understood something the nobles never could, Henry needed to believe he was in control, even as others guided his hand. Wolsey had tried to do this. He failed. Cromwell would not. When Wolsey fell, Cromwell stayed silent. No protest. No defense. Only a swift pivot. He offered the king what no one else had been brave enough to offer before, not a path to appeasement with Rome, but freedom from it. What if? Cromwell suggested quietly in early 1530. The Pope's blessing didn't matter at all. What if the king was already God's chosen authority? It was not just a solution to a failed marriage. It was a revolution. Cromwell proposed a redefinition of power itself, one that made the king's will divine, his enemies heretics, and every monk and bishop in England suddenly answerable not to Rome, but to Whitehall. And Henry impatient, brilliant, frightened. Henry listened. Cromwell drafted the Act of Supremacy in the year 1534. He designed the Treason Act that made it death to question the king's decisions. He supervised the destruction of over 500 monasteries. He watched the silver flood in from shrines, torn apart stone by stone. He engineered the deaths of abbots, priests, and knights who resisted. Each act stamped, each signature dry, each sword legal. He made terror feel like policy, and for a time, the king adored him. But adoration is not the same as love, and love in Tudor England was never the same as loyalty. At court, Cromwell became untouchable. Nobles bowed to the man they once mocked. He had no coat of arms, but he had the king's ear, and that was enough. For now, but beneath the surface, enemies gathered. The old bloodlines whispered of his arrogance, his unholy reforms, his radical friends. The Duke of Norfolk sharpened his patience like a dagger. Bishop Gardiner bided his time. They watched, they waited, and still, Cromwell pressed on. He did not slow. He believed himself safe. He had survived the gutter, the battlefield, the Vatican's shadows, and the fury of the king's court. But he had forgotten the most dangerous thing of all. He had begun to believe his own legend. The boy who had once run barefoot from the back streets of Putney had become the most feared man in England. But in the quiet corners of the court, as portraits of Anne of Cleves were being painted, as marriage negotiations crept forward, and as Cromwell prepared another move on the chessboard, there were already men sharpening axes behind closed doors. And this time, they were not his. By the spring of the year, 1533, The court of England no longer moved to the rhythm of tradition, but to the quiet footsteps of a man who once polished the boots of soldiers in Italian alleys. Thomas Cromwell had become the mind behind the throne, the silent pulse beneath every law, every decree, every judgment signed in ink that would soon be followed by blood. Yet, for all his power, there was one name that echoed through his days like a blade catching the light: Anne Boleyn. She had once been his greatest obstacle, then his most dangerous rival, and then, after a brief alliance, his final experiment in destruction. But Thomas, for all his genius, had miscalculated one thing. Anne did not vanish when her body fell limp upon the Tower Green. She remained, not as a ghost in white, but as a whisper in every chamber where a woman raised her eyes too boldly, as a question in every room where a man dared ask who truly held the king's favour. Anne had played her game with brilliance. She had outmaneuvered queens, charmed a monarch, and dared to shape the kingdom not just as a wife, but as a reformer. She had championed the poor. She had placed books in the hands of girls. She had challenged the papacy with more fire than Cromwell ever allowed himself to show. But unlike Cromwell, she had not understood that England could not be changed by kindness. It could only be remade through fear. And now, though her body lay buried in a shallow grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her voice returned in subtle, almost untraceable ways. There were women who now wrote letters quoting Anne's words. There were noblemen once silent who began to ask about the truth of her trial. Some whispered that her daughter, Elizabeth, had her mother's eyes and her father's rage. Some servants, old enough to remember the Queen's final days, dared to say what no one had admitted aloud, that Anne's only true crime was failing to be a man. Cromwell heard it all, and he remembered the look in her eyes as she knelt in the tower, dignified, furious, but resigned. He had destroyed her for the sake of order, but the order was cracking. Henry, for all his roars and silences, had never quite spoken Anne's name again. Not in anger, not in regret. He spoke of Jane Seymour, his third wife, as a gentle angel, the only true queen. Jane had died in childbed the year after Anne's execution, her body ripped open to bring Edward into the world. A Prince Cromwell had long promised the realm. That boy, small and pale, had cost the life of the only woman Henry ever seemed to genuinely mourn. And in that grief, Henry became more unpredictable than ever, sometimes weeping, sometimes bellowing at shadows, sometimes staring at a portrait for hours, as if searching for a mistake he had not made yet. Cromwell, meanwhile, busied himself with what he did best, rewriting the bones of England. He passed acts that merged crown and church so tightly that no man could separate them. He restructured taxation. He broke the last resistance of northern lords, still loyal to Rome, and he expanded the power of the royal household, so that every breath of influence passed through hands he had already measured. But in the silence of the night, he found himself remembering small, haunting things. Anne's laughter echoing in the corridors of Whitehall, the way she corrected Henry's Latin pronunciation during court masques, the way her face did not flinch when the verdict was read. He had not expected her to be so still. There were some quiet, clever people who began collecting the stories Anne had left behind. A lady-in-waiting, dismissed quietly after the Queen's death, passed her memories to a distant cousin in Calais. A musician who had once played for Anne smuggled a written ballad about her into the Low Countries. These things were small, harmless, Cromwell told himself, but they grew. He began to fear not Anne's ghost, but her legacy. Elizabeth was still young, still watched, still just a girl with red gold hair and sharp eyes who asked too many questions. But Cromwell knew what a girl with ambition could become. He had seen it once before. To silence Anne's echoes, Cromwell tightened his grip on the court. He replaced old advisers with loyal reformers. He had the king's will reshaped by lawyers who owed him everything. He even rewrote prayers to exclude saints Henry no longer respected. But power, when stretched too far, begins to tremble, like glass, just before it cracks. And Henry, who had always tolerated Cromwell's cunning as long as it served him, began to feel something he had never felt toward his chancellor before: resentment. The court had become cold. It used to sing with dance and debate. Now it creaked with paranoia. Nobles tiptoed through the halls, afraid of jesting too boldly, lest their words be twisted into treason. Ladies learned to smile without opinion. Bishops signed what they did not believe. The air itself, it seemed, had taken on the shape of Cromwell's ambition, calculated, sharp, and without warmth. And yet, beneath it all, the king was growing restless. Henry was aging. His leg ulcer worsened after the old jousting accident, years before never healed properly, and the pain made his temper even more erratic. Some days, he would praise Cromwell as the only man who had ever understood him. Other days, he would sit in council for hours, not speaking, staring at the man across from him, as though waiting for him to stumble. Cromwell did not stumble, but he had started to sweat. He began pushing forward with one final idea: a foreign alliance that would silence England's isolation. He negotiated a marriage with the sister of the Duke of Cleves, a Protestant princess who would bring strength to the Reformation and security to Henry's borders. It was logical, strategic, and, to Cromwell's eyes, flawless. But what he did not account for, what Anne Boleyn would have seen immediately, was that Henry did not care for logic. He cared for beauty, for passion, for that flicker of obsession that made a man forget his age. When the portrait of Anne of Cleves was presented, Henry approved the match. But when he met her in person, he recoiled. She was not Anne Boleyn. She did not challenge him, did not tease him, did not inspire lust or war or madness. She simply stood, proper and silent, the way most queens were trained to be. Cromwell's plan was crumbling before he even realized it. But the court did. The Duke of Norfolk began circling like a wolf. Bishop Gardiner smiled too often in council meetings. Ambassadors, once deferential, now paused before addressing Cromwell directly. There was something shifting, a chill beneath the marble. Anne Boleyn's ghost had done her work, not by haunting Cromwell, but by reminding everyone that he was not invincible, that he had killed the last queen. And queens, it turned out, were harder to erase than expected. Cromwell moved faster. He tried to fix the marriage. He offered annulment options. He examined treaties for escape clauses. But Henry, who once worshipped his every strategy, now saw him only as the man who had placed Anne of Cleves in his bed. And each awkward night the king spent beside her was another nail in Cromwell's coffin. And yet, even then, even with knives sharpening behind tapestries and prayers, muttered in Latin by those who feared the return of Rome, Thomas Cromwell believed he could escape. He had survived worse. He had built nations from ash. He had outlived queens. But power has no memory. And kings, once embarrassed, never forget. It happened on a morning that began like any other, unassuming. Grey-skied, draped in the usual whispers of court business. As the chimneys of Westminster exhaled their cold breath into the sky and the bells clanged dully in the distance, Thomas Cromwell, dressed as always in dark wool, trimmed with understated authority, walked toward the Privy Council chamber with his usual measured pace, eyes lowered, but mind alert. He had walked this corridor 100 times before, past those columns, nodded to those guards, stepped across those same stone slabs, worn smooth by the ambitions of men. There was no flicker of warning in the air, no raised voice, no sudden silence. The betrayal had already happened. He simply hadn't been told yet. Inside, the room was already full, more so than usual. That in itself should have told him something. Faces that rarely appeared together were gathered around the long table Gardiner. Norfolk, the Lord Chancellor. The men he had once outmaneuvered, now seated as if waiting to be fed. They smiled too much. Smiled too soon. But Cromwell, always self-assured, returned their pleasantries with a quiet bow and moved to take his chair. And that was when the voice came not from behind him, not from across the room, but beside him, quiet, firm, final. By order of the king, you are under arrest. At first, it didn't seem real. There were no soldiers. Not swords drawn. Just the hush of protocol and the scrape of a chair as he slowly straightened. A heartbeat passed, then another, and then the shuffle of boots. And he understood. The men were rising, not to greet him, but to step back. There would be no struggle, no protest. Cromwell was not a fool. He had built this process. He had rehearsed it with others. He knew that the more silent the betrayal, the more final the fall. Two guards stepped forward, gently but firmly taking him by the arms. He did not resist. He did not speak. Only one glance passed between him and Norfolk, one thin thread of disdain unspoken. They led him out of the room he once commanded, down halls where he had passed laws that destroyed families, and through courtyards where prisoners had once waited for his judgment. The Tower of London was waiting for him, just as it had waited for Anne Boleyn, just as it had opened for George Boleyn, for Norris, for Weston, for Brereton, for Smeaton. The difference now was that Thomas Cromwell knew precisely what came next, because he had designed it. In the small, cold cell, stripped of everything but time and memory, Cromwell finally had space to think. Not to scheme. There was nothing left to scheme, but to think. He thought of Wolsey, whose fall he had watched so carefully. He remembered the letters the old cardinal had written to the king, begging, pleading, offering bribes wrapped in praise. They hadn't worked. And yet, Cromwell tried the same. He wrote to Henry, again and again. Each letter, a blend of humility and desperation. He apologized for mistakes, explained decisions, tried to make the marriage to Anne of Cleves seem like a misunderstanding, not a betrayal. He wrote of loyalty, of duty, of all the things he had sacrificed. And still, there was no answer. He was kept alive. Curiously, not as a kindness, but as a convenience. Henry still needed him for one last service, the annulment of the marriage he had arranged. Cromwell, ever the loyal servant, even in disgrace, oversaw the legal work that would declare Anne of Cleves never truly Henry's wife. He unpicked the threads he had so carefully tied, hoping perhaps foolishly that this last act of obedience might spare him. But in truth, the moment he had been arrested, the king had already moved on. Cromwell had become a name to be erased. Outside the tower, the wolves circled. Norfolk ensured that every accusation reached the king's ears that Cromwell had corrupted the council, had pushed radical heresies into law, had manipulated foreign affairs for personal gain. Bishop Gardiner provided volumes of theological objections, pointing to every moment Cromwell had undermined the church. Nobles who had once knelt before him now queued up to spit on his name. Men he had lifted from obscurity now denounced him to save themselves. And all the while, Cromwell sat in stone silence, rereading the only words that mattered his own, in fading ink, sent to a king who no longer needed to read them. It is said that Henry's silence was more damning than his anger. He had not raged when Cromwell was taken. He had not questioned the charges. He had not demanded an explanation. That, more than anything, told Cromwell the truth. The king had already decided he was guilty, and guilt in Tudor England did not need to be proven. It needed only to be declared. The charges came swiftly: treason, heresy, corruption, the very trifecta Cromwell had perfected during his years of power. He had used these words to bring down Anne Boleyn, to crush the pilgrimage of grace, to silence nobles who dared to defy his reforms. Now the same vocabulary echoed against the walls of his own cell. He read the charges and knew they were carefully curated nonsense, partially true, mostly fiction, entirely deadly. And he saw, with agonizing clarity, the irony of it all. The machine he had built was flawless. So flawless, it could be used against its creator without a single hitch. He was allowed no defense, no trial, not jury, no witnesses. Parliament signed the Bill of Attainder, and with a stroke of a pen, Cromwell became what he had once made others a condemned man. On the 28th of July, in the year 1540, the axe was sharpened for him. The morning of his execution was warm, unseasonably so. The birds chirped, the sun bled slowly into the Thames, and the crowds gathered not in riot, not in anger, but in curiosity. They had heard of him. Of course, everyone had. The blacksmith's son, who had risen higher than any noble, who had rewritten the very language of power, who had killed queens and commanded kings. They watched as he was led out onto the scaffold, thinner now, face hollowed by the long weeks of solitude and decay. He wore a simple shirt. He held no speech. But when he opened his mouth, the words that came surprised many. He asked not for mercy, not for vengeance, but for forgiveness, for failing his king, not for the lives he had taken, nor for the faith he had suppressed, nor for the world he had reshaped in iron and fear. No, his final regret, spoken into the warm July air, was that he had disappointed the man who was about to kill him. The axe fell, and in that moment, something shifted in the realm. Not visibly, not publicly, but quietly, beneath the surface. The king had destroyed his greatest servant, and the realm, without realizing it, had just lost the last man capable of controlling the monster Henry had become. Because after Cromwell, there would be no more brakes on the engine, only fire, ash, and the rattling breath of kings alone in their power. She stood quietly, the way she always had, the folds of her gown gathered at the wrist, her hands clasped like a prayer. No one had asked her to speak. Anne of Cleves was still queen in name, though not in bed, nor in favour, nor in song. Her brief marriage to Henry VIII had lasted only 6 months, barely time to unpack her dresses, barely time to learn the sounds of the English court. Yet there she was, alive and breathing, walking the long gallery at Richmond Palace, while behind her, echoes of power collapsed one by one into dust and silence. She had survived something no one else had. She had married the king and lived. When Thomas Cromwell arranged the marriage between Henry and Anne, he thought it a masterpiece of strategy, a Protestant alliance, a useful wedge against the Catholic giants of France and the Holy Roman Empire, and a queen with no dangerous ambitions of her own. Anne was soft-spoken, modest, and, most importantly, politically valuable. But Cromwell, for all his cunning, had forgotten one thing. Henry did not marry treaties. He married faces. And when the king saw Anne for the first time, he recoiled. Not because she was ugly, though he called her so, but because she was ordinary. No danger, no spark, no fire in her gaze to match his. To Henry, she was not a queen. She was a disappointment, wrapped in silk. That disappointment festered. It poisoned every glance across the marriage bed. Every morning, Henry awoke beside a woman who reminded him not of peace, but of a decision he had not made. And Cromwell, though distant from the chambers of love, bore the weight of that resentment. Day by day, the king's patience wore thin, and when Cromwell tried, as always, to fix the problem through cleverness, searching for loopholes, proposing annulments, reworking the narrative of consummation, it was too late. The king no longer wanted a solution. He wanted a scapegoat, and Cromwell, whose voice had once held the power to change the shape of the realm, was no longer heard, only blamed. Yet Anne of Cleves remained. She watched, silently, as the man who had brought her to England was dragged to the scaffold. She heard the verdict. She heard the rumours that his head did not fall cleanly on the first stroke. She heard, most chilling of all, that he had begged the king's forgiveness before he died. But Anne, unlike the women who came before her, was not angry. She was careful. She was alone in a foreign court, surrounded by vipers with polished boots. So she did what none of Henry's other queens had done. She stepped back. She smiled. She agreed to everything. The annulment was signed. She was declared Henry's beloved sister. She received palaces, jewels, a generous allowance. She dined with the royal family, attended banquets as an honoured guest, not a discarded wife. And, in the quiet spaces of her chambers, she listened. She listened to the slow unravelling of a kingdom that had torn itself to pieces trying to satisfy one man's endless hunger, because with Cromwell gone, there was no one left to steer the storm. The nobles who had conspired against him did not understand the machinery he had built. They tried to run it with old hands, using old maps, and the kingdom groaned beneath their weight. Henry, who once had answers for every problem, now had only ghosts. He wandered the palace in a swollen body, his leg oozing with infection, his mind splintering into rages and silences. He married again Catherine Howard, barely a girl, bright-eyed and trembling. She made him feel young. She danced. She giggled. She called him my prince. And for a moment, the court breathed again. But it did not last. It never did. Anne of Cleves sat in her new home at Hever Castle and read the court dispatches with a calm eye. Catherine Howard had been raised by the same family that once watched Anne Boleyn rise and fall. The Howards were dangerous, ambitious, reckless, and Catherine, for all her innocence, was too radiant, too impulsive, too young to survive a palace that devoured beauty like meat. Anne knew this. She had known it the moment she saw Catherine smile at the king during a banquet. Her cheeks flushed, her voice high. Anne had smiled too, once, and it had almost cost her everything. When news reached Hever that Catherine had been arrested, accused of adultery, Anne did not celebrate. She lit a candle. She said nothing. But inside, something stirred a recognition, a quiet fury at the cycle that continued to consume girl after girl in the name of one man's love. Meanwhile, those who had once sworn they would never allow another Cromwell to rise began searching for one. The king, increasingly incoherent, missed the cold clarity of a man who gave him certainty. The nobles, though glad to be rid of Cromwell's reforms, now saw the chaos his absence had created. Petty squabbles became policy. Religious tensions ignited without restraint. The court fractured into camps, Catholics whispering of reconciliation with Rome, Protestants urging revolution, and Henry drifting like a wounded beast between them all. And Anne, alive, forgotten, and untouchable, watched it all. Her survival had become her revenge, Cromwell's final act, whether he intended it or not, had not been his own death. It was her life. By placing Anne in Henry's path, he had unknowingly created the one queen who would endure, not by capturing the king's heart, but by releasing it. Her quiet presence haunted the court more effectively than Anne Boleyn's fiery memory. She was a reminder that some wounds did not bleed. They simply remained. In time, Henry would grow too tired to rule, too sick to rage. He would collapse under the weight of his own appetites, surrounded by sycophants, abandoned by many who once bowed at his feet. His son, Edward, still a child, would inherit a kingdom that had been drained by war and confusion. And the Boleyn girl, the one Cromwell had once condemned by silence, would rise in the distant future to wear the crown her mother had died for. But Anne of Cleves remained in her estates, her hair grey now, her body softened by age, her face unmarked by the executioner's blade. She gardened, she rode, she laughed, she lived. And that, in the end, was Cromwell's most poetic legacy. He built a machine of control, and when it crushed him, it spared the one person no one had expected to survive. Catherine Howard laughed. She laughed with the kind of sweetness that made old men remember spring and young boys forget where they stood. Her laughter filled corridors like perfume heady. Light. Reckless. She danced with the grace of someone who had never known the price of beauty. She tilted her head when spoken to, not in fear, but in play, and for a brief, dangerous moment in the year 1540. King Henry VIII believed he was young again. It had been less than 6 months since Thomas Cromwell's head was severed on the scaffold. The dust from his fall had barely settled, the parchment of his laws still ink-wet. When Henry turned toward the Howards once more, the family that had given him Anne Boleyn, his second wife, the one he had executed for adultery and incest, now offered him another girl. A cousin this time, younger, gentler, less opinion, more fragrance. Catherine Howard. She was no reformer, no shamer, no mirror of her cousin Anne. She was, at first glance, nothing but charm stitched into velvet. But the Howards knew what they were doing. They whispered that the king needed peace. Not another religious debate. Not another political experiment. Just a soft place to rest. And Catherine, sweet, obedient, unaware, was presented not as a wife, but as a balm. She was perhaps 16, perhaps a little older. Henry was nearly 50. His leg was a rotting wound now, wrapped each morning by servants who could no longer hide their disgust. His belly sagged beneath his girdle. His temper snapped like brittle parchment. And yet, when Catherine entered a room, he sat taller. When she danced, he smiled. When she sang, he forgot. They married in the summer of the year 1540. It was swift, festive, desperate. Henry called her his rose without a thorn. But in truth, thorns were blooming everywhere. Because Catherine, unlike Anne of Cleves, was not careful. She did not study the shadows. She did not walk with her eyes lowered. She believed in happiness. She believed in youth. And youth, in Henry's court, was a dangerous thing to possess. She kept letters hidden beneath cushions. She whispered in gardens at twilight. She kissed behind tapestries. Men in her past old flames from her childhood in the Dowager Duchess's house were suddenly remembered with longing, and sometimes with recklessness. Francis Derham was one such name, Thomas Culpeper another. They had shared laughter once, and now they shared letters. Servants saw things, women noticed, and England, having learned well from Thomas Cromwell, no longer needed truth to destroy someone. Only timing. The court was shifting again. Those who had cheered Cromwell's death now argued over who would replace him in the king's trust. Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, strutted like a victorious rooster. Bishop Gardiner tightened his grip on the church. And somewhere behind them all, in the deep folds of political silence, the old machine sputtered to life again. Whispers became reports. Reports became inquiries. And inquiries, in Tudor England, led only one place, the Tower. At first, the rumours were brushed aside. The king would not listen. He refused. Catherine was young, innocent, but innocence had no weight once. Suspicion took root when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cromwell, slipped a folded letter into Henry's hand during Mass, his hand trembling. his eyes not meeting the king's. Henry did not read it at first. He placed it in his coat. He finished the service. And then, in his private chambers, he opened it. He read, and then he broke. Witnesses would later say they heard him scream, that he collapsed to the floor, crying, that he called her names he had never used before. Traitor, whore, murderess of his heart. Catherine was arrested. She was dragged from her chambers, still wearing her jewels, still smiling faintly, as if waiting for someone to say it was all a game. She did not understand at first. How could she? The world had worshipped her. How could it turn in a single hour? They told her what she was accused of: unchastity before marriage, adultery after, treason. She denied it, then confessed, then begged, then screamed. They took Francis Derham first, tortured him, then Thomas Culpeper. Their bodies were mutilated beyond recognition, displayed to remind London of the price of touching what belonged to the king. And Catherine, his rose, his delight, his second Howard Queen, was sentenced to die. She spent her last hours in the Tower's cold chambers, and the night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought into her room. She wanted to rehearse. They granted the request. She knelt. She placed her neck. She practiced, again, and again, and again. And on the morning of February 13th, in the year 1542, she walked to the scaffold in a gown of black velvet, hair braided down her back, lips parlor. She spoke clearly. She asked for forgiveness. She claimed she died a queen. And then she knelt, laid her neck on the block, and died as she had lived, beautiful, tragic, and too young. Henry did not speak of her again. He blamed others. He blamed the Howards. He blamed her upbringing. But he never blamed himself. That had become his only consistency. But behind the royal rage, the palace was changing. The courtiers had grown quieter. They no longer flirted so boldly. They did not laugh as loud. They did not gather in corners to whisper. The memory of Catherine's head falling in the cold February air was enough to teach them the lesson Cromwell had once enforced with laws. The king did not need reason. He needed satisfaction. And satisfaction, for a man like Henry, came only in blood. The fear that Cromwell had once instilled through process now returned in raw form. Execution without trial. Arrest without warning. Families destroyed because of glances, touches, words recalled too late. There was no longer a structure to it. No pretense of legality. Just wrath. And through it all, the silence of Anne of Cleves continued. She said nothing. She remained, visiting court when summoned, smiling politely, never asking, never reminding. Her survival had become prophecy, and far to the west, in the royal nursery, a girl was growing. Her name was Elizabeth. Her mother had been beheaded. Her father barely spoke her name. But in her books, in her sharp eyes, in the way she listened more than she spoke, something ancient stirred. A storm was gathering, not of swords, but of thought. And somewhere, in the broken echoes of Cromwell's ambition, in the empty offices he once ruled, a new idea was forming, not yet born, but inevitable. The world would not belong to kings forever. The king's body betrayed him before his throne ever did. By the winter of the year 1542, Henry VIII no longer looked like a monarch carved from marble or sketched in glory. He moved with pain. He breathed with difficulty. His leg, ulcerated and leaking, stank so terribly that courtiers invented ways to excuse themselves from his presence, pressing perfumed cloths to their faces or blaming imaginary ailments to step into cleaner air. The man who had once dazzled Europe with his athleticism and his music now sat swollen and silent, wrapped in fur, staring at his own reflection, as if waiting for it to blink first. Every morning, The ritual was the same. Servants entered the king's chambers like men entering a mausoleum, soft-footed, terrified, carrying clean bandages and the burden of his fury. The leg was unwrapped slowly, layer by layer, revealing skin discolored and cracked, pus oozing from the old jousting wound that had never truly healed. Surgeons tried leeches. They tried oils and pastes made of herbs and mercury and ground pearls. Nothing worked. The leg had become a symbol of everything Henry could no longer deny: time, decay, and the price of choosing rage over mercy. He did not rule anymore with the joy of conquest. He ruled because he had to, because no one else could, because to let go now would mean admitting that the pain had won, but the pain had already taken more than his flesh. It had taken his patience, his laughter, and, slowly, his mind. He began to speak to people who were not in the room. He muttered the names of women he had buried, discarded, or destroyed. Catherine, Anne, Jane, Catherine again. Names that twisted like threads around his tongue. Sometimes he cursed them. Sometimes he wept. He dreamed of Anne Boleyn, not as he remembered her, but as she had appeared in her final moments, pale, proud, neck bared to the blade. He said her lips had moved even after the head was severed, that her eyes looked at him, that she had smiled. No one dared to contradict him. Not anymore. He would wake in the night and demand to see Edward, his long-awaited son, the child born of Jane Seymour, the one he believed had justified every execution. Edward would be brought, groggy and blinking, dragged from his warm bed by servants, too afraid to disobey. The boy was small, fragile, more scholar than soldier, and Henry, seeing him, would grasp his hand too tightly and stare as if trying to will something into the boy's bones. Strength, cruelty, willpower, but the boy only looked frightened. By the year 1544, the court had become a ghost ship. Men changed allegiances by the week. Bishops rewrote sermons to please the king's shifting moods. The nobles watched one another like wolves in the cold. The memory of Cromwell still haunted the council chamber. His absence was not a silence. It was a wound. No one dared rise too high, speak too boldly, or oppose too directly. For those who reached the summit too quickly had learned, always, how steep the fall. Henry's fifth queen was gone beheaded, like the second. His fourth, Anne of Cleves, still walked quietly through gardens. He never entered. And now there was a sixth, Catherine Parr, patient and careful, older than the others, with books in her hands instead of seduction on her tongue. She had nursed the king more than she had kissed him. She spoke of God, of salvation, of kindness, and Henry, perhaps sensing the approach of eternity, let her speak. But he did not always listen. He had begun to fear judgment not from Parliament, not from Rome, not even from his enemies abroad, but from the faces that visited him in dreams. Wolsey, who had once warned him not to let his conscience drown. Cromwell, who had taught him how to kill with pen and seal. Anne Boleyn, whose death he had ordered with cold efficiency. Catherine Howard, whose childlike sobbing he sometimes heard in the corridors at night. Though she had been gone for years, he spoke of them often, not fondly, not with guilt, but with recognition, as if listing the names of people who would be present when his final hour came. And the hour was coming. By late 1546, he could no longer walk without assistance. His breath came in huffs. His moods turned faster than the wind. On some days, he ordered sermons written about loyalty and obedience. On others, he asked his physician how much longer he might rule. The physician, wisely, did not answer. He began dictating his will. He named Edward as heir, of course, but also wrote, with remarkable clarity, a council of guardians to rule until the boy came of age. He appointed men who had once feared him, once hated each other, men whose alliances were made of brittle reeds and shallow trust. He called it governance. Others called it a time bomb. And all the while, Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's daughter grew older, smarter, quiet and sharp like the edge of a well-honed dagger. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, too, watched and waited, wearing her piety like armor. The seeds had been sown long ago. Now the garden of vengeance was beginning to bloom. Henry watched them all, even as he sank deeper into his furs, his eyes clouded with pain and prophecy. He once believed he had reshaped England in his image, that he had bent fate. But in his final years, he began to see what he had truly created, a nation held together by silence, fear, and mistrust. He had broken Rome's chains only to wrap the kingdom in his own. He had executed queens, counselors, cousins, lovers, puts, and still, he was alone. On the cold morning of January 28th in the year 1547, Henry VIII died. Some said he whispered monks, monks, as he passed, the ghosts of the abbots he had executed reaching out for him. Others said he died without speaking at all, the breath leaving his body with a shudder, his fingers twitching one final time, as if trying to sign a decree that no longer mattered. No courtier wept aloud. No soldier raised his sword in grief. The bells tolled. The world turned, and in the stillness that followed, a question remained. Had England been ruled by a man or by a shadow? They placed the crown on a boy's head before he knew how to bear its weight. Edward VI was only 9 years old when his father died in the winter of the year 1547. The crown, heavy and ancient, tilted slightly on his pale brow as the archbishop's voice trembled through the coronation rites. The courtiers knelt. The choir sang. But behind the ceremony, behind the velvet and incense, lay a truth too fragile to speak aloud. England was now in the hands of a child, a boy raised on scripture, moulded by tutors, and adored by a father who had carved the world in iron so that his son might rule it in peace. But peace, like power, does not sit idle in a kingdom soaked in fear. Edward had not known his father as a man. He had known him as a presence grand, distant, terrible. He had seen the armor, the portraits, the flash of rings on enormous fingers. He had heard the stories, but he had never heard the screams. He had never seen the blood on the tower steps. He had never watched Thomas Cromwell's head fall, or Anne Boleyn's body slump forward in its final bow. All he had known was that the world bent for his father, and that he, Edward, was meant to be greater. The council Henry left behind was a powder keg, ambitious men cloaked in borrowed loyalty, smiling through their teeth as they reached for influence. At the centre of them was Edward Seymour, the boy king's uncle, who swiftly named himself Lord Protector. He took Cromwell's old seat, inherited his cold confidence, and began ruling England not as a regent, but as a shadow king. He wore the cloak of reform. He whispered promises of godliness, order, simplicity. He said they would complete what Cromwell had begun. But where Cromwell had been precise, surgical, Seymour was careless and proud. The monasteries were gone. The Latin Mass vanished. Images of saints were torn down from churches like old cobwebs. In towns and villages across the realm, altars were smashed, chalices melted, choirs silenced. The Book of Common Prayer replaced centuries of Catholic ritual. To Edward, young and devout, it was all glorious. He believed he was building the kingdom of heaven on earth. He wrote in his journal with wide-eyed certainty. He saw himself as a second Josiah, purging the idols of Baal. But he did not see the hunger. He did not smell the ash rising from burned crosses. He did not hear the weeping of old women whose faith had been ripped from them like skin from bone. In the countryside, rebellion stirred like wind through dry fields. In the summer of the year 1549, the people of Norfolk rose up. They gathered under the banner of Robert Kett, a tanner-turned leader, who demanded justice for the poor, for the hungry, for those left behind by the king's new religion. They marched to Norwich. They occupied it. For weeks, they held the city with astonishing order. They did not loot. They did not burn. They asked only that the land enclosures be reversed, that food be made affordable, that the church speak again for the common soul. Seymour's response was swift and brutal. He sent troops, canon, fire. Over 2,000 rebels were slaughtered. Kett was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, his body left to rot as a warning. The message was clear. Mercy had no place in a kingdom born from the methods of Thomas Cromwell. But the cracks were showing. While Edward wrote of God's glory, his uncle waged wars on two fronts against the Scots to the north and the French to the south. The treasury bled. Coinage was debased. Inflation soared. Grain price doubled. The English people, once promised paradise, now stood in line for bread. And in the council chamber, the vultures gathered again. John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, saw what Seymour could not. Power could no longer be claimed by titles alone. It had to be taken with charm, patience, and precision. He flattered the young king. He listened when others ordered. He waited while Seymour burned his bridges. And then, when the moment came in the autumn of the year, 1550, Dudley struck. Seymour was arrested on vague charges. Naturally, the kind Cromwell had perfected. He was imprisoned in the Tower, and then quietly executed. Edward cried. But he signed the warrant. Dudley became Lord President. He did not take the title of Protector, but his control was absolute. He restructured the council, purged Catholics and moderates, and built a circle of reformers around the boy king. He encouraged Edward's religious zeal. He told him he was chosen. He gave him the illusion of rule, while quietly ensuring the crown's every act bore his own fingerprints. And yet, Dudley was no Cromwell. He had learned the form, not the function. For while Cromwell had known how to preserve the illusion of royal will, Dudley pushed Edward too far. The boy king, thin, pale, and increasingly sick, began drafting plans for the future. He did not want Mary, his half-sister, to rule. She was Catholic. She was dangerous. He did not trust her. He was not wrong, but in writing her out of the succession, he disturbed the careful balance of Tudor blood. Dudley encouraged it. He arranged a marriage between his own son, Guildford, and Lady Jane Grey, Edward's cousin. The plan was simple when Edward died. Jane would rule, and Dudley would become the father of the king. But Edward was dying faster than any of them had anticipated. By the spring of the year, 1553, he could no longer rise from bed. His cough tore through him. His skin grew waxen. Physicians claimed it was consumption. Some whispered poison. But no one dared name the real cause, a kingdom devouring itself. In his final weeks, Edward wrote his device for the succession, naming Jane his heir. He signed it. He sealed it. He believed it would hold. And then, in July of that same year, he died, barely 15 years old. A king who had never ruled. A reformer who never saw the fruits of his faith. Jane was proclaimed queen. She wept, not out of joy, but fear. She had never wanted the crown. And 9 days later, Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, marched into London with the people at her back, the nobles at her side, and vengeance burning in her blood. Dudley was executed. Jane was imprisoned. The Protestant kingdom began to unravel. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet between thunder and fall, the shadow of Thomas Cromwell lingered. His methods had birthed a nation, but they had not given it a soul. She rode into London with the banners of the old faith snapping in the wind, the crimson cross of Spain stitched into her memory and her will. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, widow's child. Exile's shadow had waited her whole life for the throne, and now it was hers. The crowds filled the streets, not with fear, but with fervour. They had seen what reform had brought: smashed altars, shuttered churches, hunger, rebellion. A boy, king dead, before his voice had fully broken, and a queen who reigned for 9 days before being cast aside like a pawn misplayed. Mary, in that moment, was not just a monarch, she was retribution. And retribution wears a familiar face in England. The machinery that Thomas Cromwell had constructed of accusations, outsiders, executions, and orchestrated trials was still there, silent and waiting, like a guillotine in the dark. Mary did not need to reinvent it. She simply gave it new names. Where Cromwell had once cried heresy against the papists, Mary now cried treason against the reformers. Where Cromwell had used ink to destroy abbots, Mary used flame to destroy preachers. It was the same instrument. Only the hands had changed. Her first act was to restore the Mass. Latin returned to the churches. Priests stepped from hiding. The crucifix was lifted once again. The people, confused but weary, accepted it like a familiar lullaby. And then the fires began. In the winter of the year 1554, the first heretics were burned. They were not nobles. They were not enemies of the crown. They were artisans, cloth workers, poor men and women who refused to renounce the Book of Common Prayer or the memory of Edward's Reformation. They were dragged to Smithfield. They were chained to stakes. They were set alight. The crowd gathered. Some cheered. Some prayed. Some vomited. Mary did not watch, but she listened. And then came the nobles. Then came the bishops. Then came the names carved into the bones of English reform: Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, Thomas Cranmer, who had anointed Jane Grey, Cranmer, who had annulled Mary's mother's marriage, Cranmer, who had whispered in Edward's ear. He was brought to the fire slowly, carefully, publicly. He recanted, then recanted his recantation. And in the end, as the flames licked his robes, he thrust the hand that had signed the recantation into the blaze first. "Let it burn," he said. "Let the hand burn first." The people began to murmur. They called her the Bloody Queen. They wrote her cruelty in verse, etched her vengeance into woodcuts that would survive centuries. But what they did not see, what no artist captured, was that Mary did not delight in death. She did not laugh at the flames. She believed she was saving their souls. She believed she was saving England. And perhaps that was what made it so terrible. She married Philip of Spain in the summer of the year 1554. He was cold, distant, and had no love for his wife or her people. But he brought alliance, power, and the hope of a child. Mary believed, with all her heart, that if she bore a son, it would all be worth it, the executions, the terror, the reversal of Cromwell's legacy. The child would be the answer to every wound. England would heal. She became swollen. Her belly rose. She retreated from court, praying, knitting, whispering names for a boy who would never be born. The months passed. No labour came. No crying filled the palace. And slowly, the belly shrank. It had been wind, or hope, or a cruel trick of the body. There would be no heir. The fires continued. Over 280 people were burned under Mary's rule. Villages blackened by smoke. Families shattered. Children orphaned. England flinched with every dawn, unsure whose turn it was next. And somewhere, In the echo of those flames, Thomas Cromwell's shadow flickered. His methods had survived. His scaffolds, his gallows, his silence, but his vision had not. The England he built had no saints. No Latin, no Pope. The England Mary tried to resurrect had no loyalty. Only exhaustion. The people did not fight her, but they did not love her. They watched, they waited, and when she died alone, childless, racked with uterine cancer, in the autumn of the year 1558, they did not wail, they bowed their heads, and then, quietly, they moved on, because waiting in the wings was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the girl who had watched each turn of the blade from the nursery window, who had read in silence while fires consumed those she admired, who had walked the narrow path between her mother's memory and her father's violence. She had learned from Cromwell, though she had never known him. She had learned from Mary, though she had nearly died by her hand. She had learned that England did not want saints. It wanted stability, and so she gave them an illusion of both. Under Elizabeth, the fires were extinguished. The laws were rewritten. The Church of England returned not by blood, but by policy. The Protestants who had once fled now came back with books, ideas, and caution. The Catholics who remained kept their faith behind closed doors. The silence returned, and Cromwell's England fragmented. Haunted, scorched was finally sealed into the bedrock. He was never honoured, never spoken of with warmth. His bones were buried in disgrace. His legacy tangled in contradictions. He had been a servant who rose too high, a reformer who killed to preserve power, a commoner who dared to make kings bow. But in the end, the world he forged outlived him. The monarchs changed. The flames were doused. The names written in blood faded into ash. But the system remained. Parliament, sovereignty, reformation, all born from the mind of a blacksmith's son. And when Elizabeth stood beneath the painted ceilings of Whitehall, the crown gleaming upon her brow, she did not speak of Cromwell, but she ruled within the world he had made. A world where thrones could be shattered and rebuilt, where faith could be replaced with law, where power no longer needed a pope, only a pen.